everyone. So I'm from a very small town in Vermont, a town that's so small that we actually don't have a municipal government. Rather, we have a town meeting where every year the residents come together and they discuss and vote on how much money is going to go to the schools, how much is going to go to the roads, and who's going to be in charge of collecting stray dogs for that year. And so this was very much my introduction to politics and my introduction to economics. And so you can probably only imagine my horror when I entered into university and started to learn that there was this assumption that the economy was governed by its own natural laws and not by us. And this really began my now decades-long love-hate relationship with economics, because I feel that one of the greatest tricks played on humanity has been to present the economy as this abstract, all-important force that is out there beyond our control. Because the reality is that we are the economy. Yeah? The economy is just the way that we produce and provide for one another. And once we recognize that the way we produce and provide for one another is always going to be influenced by our history, our geography, our culture, our politics, and so much more, we realize that there can be no one-size-fits-all economic model. And equally, there's no perfect alternative economic model waiting to be imposed upon us. We must build the better economy and world we envision. And so it's for this reason that I started working in economic policy, and specifically industrial policy, because I wanted to challenge this neoliberal idea that governments and the people they represent should take a hands-off approach to economic governance. And so one of the most important projects I actually worked on during this time was actually funded by GIZ, and it was called the Enhancing the Quality of Industrial Policies, or EQUIP. And I think what was so important about this approach was that it was about building the capacity of governments to design and for people to design their own economic policies, as opposed to relying on external experts. And it always began with this question of your development goals, and ask the question, why? Why do you want economic growth? Why do you want foreign direct investment? What are you really trying to achieve through your economic development and through this economic policy? And these questions were so rarely asked, but they're really important because they helped you to really gain an understanding of the true motivation and vision for a country. And in Mozambique, it was resilience. In Myanmar, it was rural-urban inequality reduction. In Ukraine, it was peace. And the goals we set matter, because if Myanmar wants to reduce inequality, then they probably shouldn't follow the standard growth strategy of attracting multinational corporations who consolidate wealth better than anyone, and perhaps rather focus on supporting cooperatives or informal rural firms that are going to be able to ensure more equitable distributions of wealth and power first time around, and be able to build the local economic multipliers needed for broad-based development. These kind of considerations were ultimately what made me realize that the goals and the frameworks that we set are so important for how we evaluate our economy's success. Because ultimately, this isn't a question of growth or no growth, but growth of what and why. Because if we continue to use economic indicators as our metrics of success, we will always be evaluating the economy by its capacity to support itself and not our general well-being. And so this sort of ideas and considerations led me quite naturally to the Wellbeing Economy Movement and to the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, or We All, because here was a collaboration of policymakers, organizations, change makers, activists, academics, who all recognized and believed that a different economic system is not only possible, but we can all be a part of it together to build it. And so the Wellbeing Economy Movement comes under a lot of different banners, like circular economy, post-growth, donut economics, business for the common good, and many more. But at their heart, it's this recognition that we have to stop treating people and planet like they're here to serve the economy, and start treating the economy like it's here to serve us. And so this is all about centering the things that truly matter for a good life. Things like our social connections, our health, a thriving ecosystem, so that we can then design economies that are fit for purpose. And so this shift from growth to well-being begins with a different vision of progress and development. As for too long, we've had this development narrative that if we can just grow our economies as quickly as possible and generate enough wealth, everything will be okay. But what I think what's really important is that in this moment, it's actually the rich communities that are having an existential crisis about this and recognizing that we might have gotten this logic wrong. And so, as Sandrine was saying earlier, we now see that the vast majority of people in the G20 countries, the supposed winners of this system, are calling on their national economic priorities to move beyond a focus on profits and wealth, to prioritizing human well-being and ecological protection. And from the local to global, we're starting to see governments who are really heeding this call. And so the Wellbeing Economy governments, for example, is a really good illustration of this, with Canada, New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Scotland, and Wales all developing alternative indicators to GDP that really center social and ecological well-being as their new metric of success. And I guess if I can say one thing about my experience working for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, it is that this beyond GDP movement, which once felt quite fringe, is nearly mainstreamed. And because once you consider the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, you could say that pretty much every country in the world now has alternative indicators that really center and consider social and ecological dimensions of development. But the issue is that it seems like a lot of governments and societies get stuck there, unable to make sense of these multidimensional indicators that are seemingly in competition with one another. Because ultimately, I think the problem is that we're trying to elevate social and environmental issues to the level of the economic, but they're not commensurate. The economy is just a part of society, embedded with a larger ecosystem. And so ultimately, we elevated the economy for so long that it's very hard for us to move beyond this economic logic that makes us feel like we have to rationalize why health matters because of its economic benefits, for example, rather than evaluating our economy by its contribution to our health. And that is no small switch, because it really does require us to downgrade the economy and recognize that it is a means and not an end in and of itself. And so this starts by asking ourselves what matters for a good life, so that we can consider the ways that people and planet can provide for one another, so that it supports the well-being not only now, but for generations to come. And so I think the major innovations of the future will come from institutions or governments, academics, who take this next step of centering social and ecological well-being and then disaggregating economic information so that you can actually identify the regenerative production processes, the equitable business models, the goods and the services that actually are contributing most to social and ecological well-being, so that they can be encouraged and rewarded in the way that large exploitive corporations have been for so long, because they were so helpful for growth. And so what I think is profound about the Wellbeing Economy movement is that it actually calls into question the very fundamental assumptions about what determines our level of development. Because if a true development is sustainable well-being, then I can just say that for myself, my country, the United States, we are far from developed. Because we may have a very high GDP per capita, but we're miserable and our country's on fire. And so I remember feeling an incredible amount of shame on a project I was working on in Mozambique when I heard an economist explain to me that it would take time for them to transform their culture in order to achieve the level of development we enjoyed in the United States. He explained that investors had a hard time in Mozambique because people would come to work for a couple days and then leave and go back to their villages and wouldn't come back until they needed more money for their community and families. He said that what they lacked was a work ethic, and what I realized is that they had a culture that understood enough. And I realized in that moment I didn't have a concept of enough. We don't even consider this notion within the United States because it really stands in conflict with the values of progress and ambition that we hold so dear. And so asking myself the question of when would I be satisfied, how much is enough, was really profound. And it made me realize that I have a lot more to learn than to teach about the values and the wisdom actually needed to animate a well-being economy. And so I think what's significant about the Wellbeing economy movement is that it is accelerating and spreading so quickly throughout the high-income Western countries. And this is important because, let's be honest, we're the problem, yeah? But as Lorenzo was saying earlier, this concept is not new and it is not our own. It comes from indigenous and alternative development paradigms such as Ubuntu or Swaraj, Buen Vivir, which are all about recognizing that true progress is living in harmony with oneself, others, and our natural environment. And these are about philosophies that really recognize that I am because you are. And therefore, what we need to prioritize is not growth, but balance. And so we're in this moment of really profound paradigm shift, I think, as a society, which is calling for us to move from these really linear, mechanistic, hierarchical, and siloed ways of thinking and organizing processes, and move towards much more holistic, compassionate, and emergent forms. And this shift is painful because it requires us to recognize that just because we're rich doesn't mean we're right, and that ultimately the solutions we seek may actually come from many of the communities that we have viewed as undeveloped for so long. And so my hope is that if GIZ is really serious about supporting the Wellbeing economy movement, the best thing that they can do is to actually help to identify, amplify, and learn from alternative economic and cultural practices that really represent a well-being economy in action. Societies and communities that give back to nature as much as they take, who provide for one another out of a sense of collective responsibility as opposed to individual entitlement. As we are lost if we forget that everything we produce comes first and foremost from the earth, and everything we provide is valuable insofar as it contributes to our well-being. And so I'll end just by saying that the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is all about building a movement, a mass new power base of actors who come from every sector and walk of life, because we recognize that the only way we can transform this system is if we come together across space. And so I'm thrilled that you're discussing this, and I hope you'll consider joining us and recognizing that once we realize we are the economy, we realize we can change it. And when we change it, we change the world.